Colorado River Basin snowpack levels are near record lows, and that has an impact on Lake Mead's water levels, which in turn can have an impact on our water bills as well.
There is one number that keeps water experts awake at night, yet most people have never heard of it. 895 feet. That is the level where Lake Mead reaches what engineers call dead pool, the point at which water can no longer flow naturally through Hoover Dam. If the lake ever falls that low, hydroelectric power would stop, water deliveries would be severely disrupted, and millions of people across the American Southwest could face an unprecedented crisis. In the summer of 2022, Lake Mead dropped to around 1,040 feet above sea level, its lowest level since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s. It had never been closer to dead pool in its nearly 90-year history. Heavy snowfall in the Rocky Mountains has helped the lake recover slightly since then, making it appear as though the worst is over. But the numbers tell a very different story. To understand why experts remain concerned, you first have to see what Hoover Dam looks like today. Driving across Highway 93 into Black Canyon, one feature immediately catches your attention: a massive white bathtub ring stretching along the canyon walls. It marks where the water once stood before slowly retreating year after year. The white stain rises higher than a 10-story building, stretches for miles, and has become one of the clearest symbols of the Colorado River crisis. At full capacity, Lake Mead holds about 26 million acre-feet of water and sits at 1,221 feet above sea level. Today, even after recent recovery, it remains only around 1,070 to 1,080 feet, still roughly 140 feet below full pool. A reservoir built to store nearly 9 years of river flow now contains only about 2 years' worth of water. And this is where the real story begins. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We bring you the biggest environmental, science, and engineering stories, explained in a way you won't find anywhere else. Because what happened to Lake Mead didn't begin with a drought. It began with a decision made more than a century ago. This is not simply a drought. It is a problem rooted in mathematics, a mathematical mistake made more than a century ago. The story begins in November 1922, when representatives from 7 western states gathered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to negotiate the agreement that became known as the Colorado River Compact. Leading those negotiations was Herbert Hoover, then serving as Secretary of Commerce, long before he became President of the United States and years before Hoover Dam even existed. The objective sounded straightforward: divide the Colorado River among the 7 states that depended on it: Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Using river flow records available at the time, negotiators agreed to allocate approximately 16.5 million acre-feet of water each year. The upper basin received 7.5 million acre-feet, the lower basin received another 7.5 million, and an additional 1.5 million acre-feet was later committed to Mexico under an international treaty. On paper, the agreement appeared fair, but it rested on one critical assumption that no one at the negotiating table fully understood. The river measurements they relied upon came from an unusually wet period in history. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Colorado River experienced several decades of exceptionally strong flows, creating the illusion that the river consistently carried far more water than it actually does over the long term. In reality, later research using more than 1,000 years of tree ring records showed a very different picture. Climate scientists found that the Colorado River's average natural flow is closer to 12 to 13 million acre-feet per year, with some years dropping below 10 million. In other words, the Colorado River Compact promised roughly 25 to 30% more water than the river typically provides. Even more remarkable, some experts at the time suspected the measurements were overly optimistic. They warned that the available records represented an unusually wet chapter in the river's history. But after years of negotiations, political leaders were unwilling to restart the process with smaller numbers. The agreement moved forward anyway. From that moment on, the Southwest began dividing water that in many years simply wasn't there. For decades, the problem remained hidden because Lake Mead and Lake Powell acted like enormous savings accounts, storing surplus water collected during wetter years, and quietly covering the growing gap between supply and demand. For decades, the Colorado River states were withdrawing more water than the river could naturally replace. That imbalance wasn't immediately obvious, because Lake Mead and Lake Powell had enormous reserves built up during wetter decades. Those reservoirs acted like a savings account, covering the annual deficit, but that reserve is now running dangerously low, and once the savings are gone, every shortage is felt immediately. Unfortunately, that's only part of the problem. The other challenge is something climate scientists call a megadrought. According to researchers at UCLA, the Colorado River Basin is experiencing its most severe prolonged dry period in at least 1,200 years. This isn't just one bad season. It's the driest extended stretch since around the 800s, centuries before the Magna Carta, before Oxford University was founded, and long before Europeans reached North America. Now imagine combining a river that was over-allocated from the very beginning with the worst long-term drought in over a millennium. Yet today, more than 25 million people depend on that same river for drinking water, farming, electricity, and daily life. Recent winters have brought encouraging snowfall across the Rockies, helping Lake Mead recover by roughly 30 to 40 feet after its historic 2022 low. Many headlines celebrated the rise as a sign that the crisis was ending, but the reality is very different. A lake that remains about 140 feet below full capacity isn't recovering, it is simply getting temporary relief. The fundamental problem has not changed. Each year, the 7 basin states are still allowed to use roughly 3 to 4 million acre-feet more water than the river typically supplies. Think of it like earning $12,000 each year while spending $16,000. Even if you receive a one-time bonus, you're still living beyond your income. The financial pressure never disappears. It only slows down for a while. That has been the Colorado River's reality for more than 20 years. If you're enjoying this breakdown, don't forget to subscribe. We cover major environmental stories, water crises, and earth science with clear explanations that go beyond the headlines. Now let's turn our attention to Hoover Dam itself. Hoover Dam isn't just a massive concrete barrier. It's also one of the largest hydroelectric power stations in the western United States. When construction finished in 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule, it stood as the largest concrete structure ever built. Rising 726 feet above the canyon floor, it required thousands of workers who endured temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. 96 workers lost their lives during construction, making the project both an engineering triumph and a human sacrifice. The dam generates electricity using hydraulic head, the vertical distance between the lake's surface and the turbines below. Water plunges through giant intake towers, races down enormous pipes, and strikes the turbines with tremendous force. The higher the lake, the greater the pressure, and the more electricity the dam can generate. At full capacity, Hoover Dam can produce around 2,080 megawatts of electricity, enough to power roughly 1.3 million homes across Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California. But as Lake Mead has fallen, so has the dam's generating power. By the record low of 2022, electricity production had dropped by roughly 25 to 40%. To keep the facility operating, the Bureau of Reclamation installed emergency low-water turbines designed to function under reduced pressure. In other words, one of America's most iconic hydroelectric plants has already been forced to rely on backup systems simply to keep producing power. But losing electricity is only part of the crisis. Las Vegas faces an even more immediate threat: its drinking water. The city's original intake pipes were designed decades ago, assuming Lake Mead would remain safely above 1,000 feet. As the reservoir steadily declined toward that level, engineers realized a frightening possibility. If the water dropped any farther, those intake pipes could begin drawing air instead of water. For a metropolitan area of more than 2.2 million people, where nearly 90% of the drinking water comes from Lake Mead, that isn't simply an engineering challenge. It's a matter of survival. One person recognized this danger long before most others did. Pat Mulroy, who led the Southern Nevada Water Authority for more than 20 years, began raising alarms soon after taking office in 1989. She closely followed climate research, tracked the lake's declining elevation, and repeatedly warned that Las Vegas was heading toward a future few people wanted to acknowledge. Many dismissed her concerns. Critics accused her of exaggerating the threat to justify expensive infrastructure projects. But instead of only issuing warnings, she pushed forward with a solution. That solution became known as the third straw, a massive intake tunnel drilled deep beneath Lake Mead at an elevation of roughly 860 feet, far below the city's original intake pipes. Stretching nearly 3 miles through solid bedrock beneath the lakebed, the project required years of construction and carried a price tag of approximately $1.4 billion before being completed in 2015. At the time, many questioned whether such an expensive project was really necessary. Then came 2022. As Lake Mead approached record low levels and the original intake system neared its operating limits, the third straw proved its value. Without it, Las Vegas could have faced a severe interruption to its water supply. But even this remarkable engineering achievement solved only one problem. It didn't create more water. It simply allowed Las Vegas to keep drawing from the bottom of a reservoir that continues to shrink. And no other community in the Colorado River Basin has a backup system quite like it. The consequences have been far more severe elsewhere. In Pinal County, Arizona, located about an hour south of Phoenix, farming communities have already experienced what water shortages truly look like. The Central Arizona Project Canal carries Colorado River water across 336 miles of desert, delivering water to central and southern Arizona through one of the largest and most expensive water systems ever constructed. When the federal government officially declared a Colorado River shortage in 2022, farmers in Pinal County were among the first to lose their allocations because they held junior water rights. The impact was immediate. Fields that had produced cotton, alfalfa, and grain for generations suddenly dried out. From the air, green farmland gave way to vast stretches of cracked brown earth. Farmer Will Thalander told reporters he had been forced to abandon more than 1,000 acres of productive farmland because there simply wasn't enough water left to keep it alive. For many local families, agriculture wasn't just a business, It was a way of life passed down through generations. Now those legal water rights exist mostly on paper, backed by a river that can no longer meet all of its promises. The crisis has also affected the Action Indian community, whose people have depended on irrigated farming for centuries. After spending decades fighting through Congress and the courts to secure their water rights, they now face reductions caused by a shortage they did not create. For them, the loss represents far more than an economic setback. It is another broken promise added to a history already filled with them. Meanwhile, Lake Mead itself has begun revealing stories hidden beneath its surface. As the shoreline retreated, objects that had remained underwater for decades slowly emerged from the mud. In May 2022, authorities discovered a rusted barrel containing human remains near Hemingway Harbor. Not long afterward, additional skeletal remains were uncovered in nearby areas. Investigators believe at least some of these victims died during the 1970s and 1980s, with clothing and other evidence matching that era. Many suspect they were homicide victims whose bodies had been dumped into the lake when water levels were high enough to conceal the evidence forever. Instead, the historic drought exposed secrets that had remained hidden for nearly half a century. Around the same time, another remarkable discovery surfaced near the Overton arm of Lake Mead. As the water receded, a World War II-era Higgins landing craft emerged from the mud, the same type of flat-bottomed boat used by Allied troops during the D-Day landings in Normandy. Every foot that Lake Mead loses isn't just reducing America's water supply. It's uncovering forgotten pieces of history that had been buried beneath the lake for generations. That Higgins landing craft had been used for survey operations on Lake Mead during the 1940s before eventually sinking beneath the water. It remained hidden on the lakebed for almost 8 decades until the falling water level exposed it once again. It wasn't the only forgotten relic to reappear. As Lake Mead continued to shrink, abandoned boats, old marina structures, and even sections of the original canyon landscape that existed before Hoover Dam was built slowly emerged from beneath the surface. It was as if an entire submerged world was rising back into view. Every new discovery made headlines, but each headline carried the same message. Lake Mead had fallen farther than almost anyone imagined possible, revealing history that had remained hidden for generations. Yet even these dramatic discoveries, the declining power output, the threat to Las Vegas's water supply, abandoned farmland, and human remains uncovered by the drought, represent only the local consequences. The larger crisis stretches far beyond Lake Mead. Roughly 300 miles upstream, along the Utah-Arizona border, sits Lake Powell, America's second-largest reservoir. Held back by Glen Canyon Dam, it serves as another vital storage system for the Colorado River. And it has been following the same troubling trend. Year after year, its water level has steadily declined. By 2022, conditions had become so severe that the Bureau of Reclamation was forced to release emergency water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming, more than 400 miles upstream, simply to keep enough water behind Glen Canyon Dam to continue generating electricity. In effect, the federal government was transferring water from one struggling reservoir to another, buying time rather than solving the underlying problem. Now consider the situation from an even wider perspective. The Colorado River does far more than supply cities like Las Vegas or Phoenix. It also supports one of America's most important agricultural regions. California's Imperial Valley, located in the Sonoran Desert near the Mexican border, receives very little rainfall each year. Yet thanks to Colorado River irrigation, nearly 700,000 acres of farmland remain productive. That farmland supplies roughly 2/3 of America's winter vegetables. The lettuce sold in January, the broccoli harvested in February, and the carrots, stocked in supermarkets throughout early spring, often begin their journey in the Imperial Valley. If significant reductions ever reach that region, the consequences won't stop at California. They will be felt in grocery stores from coast to coast, driving food shortages and higher prices across the country. What appears to be a regional water problem is actually a national food security issue, and there is another stakeholder many Americans rarely think about: Mexico. Under a 1944 international treaty, the United States is obligated to deliver approximately 1.5 million acre-feet of Colorado River water to Mexico each year. That legal commitment remains in place even as water supplies continue shrinking. While the 7 U.S. states fight over a shrinking Colorado River, Mexico also holds legally protected water rights under an international treaty. With the current Colorado River rules expiring in 2026, the states face one of the toughest water negotiations in American history. The upper basin states want to protect their unused allocations, while the lower basin states argue they must supply millions of people, major cities, and vital farmland. But the river doesn't follow politics. It only provides about 12 to 13 million acre-feet of water each year, even though legal agreements promise 16.5 million. The result is a crisis that no negotiation alone can solve. The clearest proof is that the Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. Once it flowed into the Sea of Cortez through a vast wetland ecosystem. Today, much of that river delta has dried up, and communities like the Cocopah have watched the river that shaped their history almost disappear. Hoover Dam itself remains one of the strongest engineering achievements ever built, but even it cannot function without enough water. Lake Mead is still about 140 feet below full capacity. Power production has declined, farms receive less water, and every year more water is used than the river naturally replaces. As Pat Mulroy once warned, the real question was never whether the Colorado River would face a shortage. It was whether people would act before it became too late. Today, the warning signs are impossible to ignore, and the white bathtub ring around Lake Mead continues creeping closer to the critical 895-foot dead pool level.